We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
In President Dwight D. Eisenhower's famous 1961 speech about the dangers of the military-industrial complex,
the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
He also warned Americans about the growing power of a scientific technological elite.
The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present.
The federal government had become a major financier of scientific research after World War II, and Eisenhower was worried that the spirit of open inquiry and progress would be corrupted by the priorities of the federal bureaucracy.
Public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite.
It is time to stand up for science.
Today, the people protesting the Trump administration's cuts to federal funding for scientific research are part of that scientific and technological elite.
The Trump administration's drastic cuts are already having an alarming impact on medical research in our country.
These cuts would be devastating, stopping vital biomedical research.
Labs already reportedly shutting down across the country.
And there's a good chance that slashing federal spending will liberate science from the corrupting forces that Eisenhower warned us about.
If you look at particularly 19th century Britain, when science was absolutely in the private sector, we have some of the best science going.
Terence Keeley is a professor of clinical biochemistry at the University of Buckingham.
Charles Darwin was a rich person. Even men who had no money had access to rich men's money one way or another. So in those days of laissez-faire, the rich paid for science. If you look at GDP per capita, the story is dramatic. The French and German governments funded science very generously, but their GDPs per capita absolutely didn't even approximate to Britain's, let alone overtake, which is what American GDP per capita did.
Thomas Edison's industrial lab produced huge breakthroughs in telecommunications and electrification. Alexander Graham Bell's lab produced modern telephony and sound recording, all without government money. The Wright Brothers, who ran a bicycle shop before revolutionizing aviation, launched the first successful manned airplane flight in December 1903, beating out more experienced competitors like Samuel Langley, Secretary of the Smithsonian, who had received a grant from the War Department for his research.
So the Industrial Revolution was British, and the Second Industrial Revolution was American, and both were in the absence of the government funding of science.
The idea that the government needs to accelerate scientific progress was based on America's experience during World War II, when federally funded research led to breakthroughs in rocketry, medicine, and radar. The Manhattan Project, which cost $27 billion in today's dollars, employed more than 500,000 people and culminated in the creation of the atom bomb and the discovery of nuclear fission.
Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war.
Lobbyists took the Manhattan Project and said, look what government funding of science can do, and they then twisted it.
In November 1944, President Roosevelt sent a letter to Vannevar Bush, who was the director of the U.S. Office of Science and Development. Roosevelt instructed Bush to come up with a plan to make federal funding of scientific research permanent.
During the last 40 years, Dr. Bush has been one of the nation's leaders in the great onrush of science and engineering.
Science has been remaking our lives in every way. It's going to do so in the future. And it's inevitable, therefore, that scientists and engineers have far more to do with government.
It has been basic United States policy that government should foster the opening of new frontiers, wrote Bush. Bush's treatise eventually led to the creation of the National Science Foundation in 1950. But it was a stunning accomplishment from America's greatest rival that would supercharge the nationalization of science.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket.
Sputnik, the world's first man-made satellite, seemed to confirm fears that the Soviets, with their centrally planned economy, might eclipse the U.S. in scientific innovation and weapons technology.
That turned out to be completely wrong. But in 1957, Americans were terrified.
Russia's getting into space really bothers me because it's making the Cold War between Russia and the United States, more intense.
We should find out what they're doing that we're not doing. and we should do something about it very quickly.
After Sputnik, the Eisenhower administration tripled the budget of the National Science Foundation, which would provide federal grants to universities and labs. If federal funding of science is counterproductive, then what explains the success of Sputnik and the Manhattan Project? Well, of course, government funding has led to major breakthroughs, both during and after World War II, such as the synthesis and mass production of penicillin during the war, cancer immunotherapy, artificial heart valves, and the gene editing technology CRISPR. But you have to compare that to what might have otherwise happened. Good economics takes into account not only the seen, but the unseen. So what are the unseen innovations the world misses out on when governments set the research agenda?
If the government funds science, it actually takes the best scientists out of industry and puts them in the universities, and then industry, in fact, suffers.
After Sputnik, government money pushed basic science out of the private sector. 2/3 of all research and development was paid for by the federal government by 1964.
If you were a tool maker in Ohio in 1964 and you wanted to invest in R&D to make better tools because you wanted to beat your competitors in Utah, you wrote a grant to the Department of Commerce. Can you believe it? That's how nationalized American science was in 1964.
The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present.
Eisenhower's warning is absolutely correct. You try saying in an American university, governments shouldn't fund science, you will not be well received. There's an enormous amount of self-censorship.
In academic science, process takes precedence over outcomes. Researchers are incentivized to publish peer-reviewed papers that garner citations, which helps them to secure prestigious academic posts and more federal grants.
What happens under peer review under the government when there's a homogenization and only one set of ideas is allowed to emerge? There is enormous self-censorship.
The pressure to accrue citations has created a positivity bias, where an increasing number of papers supporting a hypothesis are published, while negative findings are often buried. One biotech company could only replicate 6 out of 53 landmark cancer studies. Swedish researchers found that up to 70% of positive findings in certain brain imaging studies could be false. A team of researchers re-examined 100 psychology studies and successfully replicated only 39. They concluded that there is still more work to do to verify whether we know what we think we know. In an influential 2005 paper, Stanford professor John Ioannidis flatly concluded most public research findings are false.
The trouble is that because of peer review and because of the corporate nature and because there was only one funder, the government, you end up with a monolithic view, and so you crush what's so important in science, which is different ideas competing in a marketplace of ideas.
For decades, the federal government advised Americans to avoid saturated fat based on the work of a researcher named Ancel Keys, who received substantial funding from the U.S. Public Health Service and the NIH.
For 30 years, we had this nutrition pyramid telling us what was healthy and what wasn't healthy. Actually, it was a very good pyramid as long as you inverted it and did the exact opposite, but that wasn't what they told us. But Ancel Keys said, I have the solution. It's all to do with fat. And so he initially started off by getting a group of scientists together under the auspices and money of the American Heart Foundation. And very quickly, you couldn't get grants unless you subscribed to Ancel Keys' theory of fat. Having captured this small little redoubt, he then moved to the NSF. And then suddenly the whole world believed only one thing.
More recently, Stanford's Jay Bhattacharya was attacked by the public health establishment for questioning the COVID lockdowns. He told Reason there's an inherent conflict between the NIH director setting public health policy and doling out grant money.
I just don't think the NIH director should play a big role in health policy, because if you have an NIH director that does, they control the minds of so many scientists.
Bhattacharya, who Trump appointed head of the NIH, now faces a proposed 40% spending cut at the agency. That could accelerate medical innovation in the long run.
If these changes can be managed in such a way that these scientists can move from the NIH into the private sector without massive disruptions to all the work and research they're doing, that will be to the benefit of America.
It would be similar to what happened in the early 1970s, when Congress slashed DARPA's budget in half, laying the groundwork for the rise of the computer age.
And what happens to all those scientists? Well, They all go out to Silicon Valley because they've all been made redundant. They're all physical scientists. And they invent the modern world. And so halving DARPA's budget transformed physical science in Silicon Valley. It was the best thing that could have happened to America.
Roosevelt drew the wrong conclusions about science from the war. Vision, boldness, and drive can be found amongst the dreamers and tinkerers working in private laboratories, who were often too iconoclastic to be good candidates for government research grants, but whose ideas simply work.
It's technology that keeps science honest. So if you're a scientist and you make an observation which can be tested, if you do this, the rocket will go that way. If you do this, the rocket will go this way. And it can be tested by technology. Then as a scientist, you have to be honest because you'll soon be found out. But if your money comes from the government and it comes by peer review from committees, and the committees subscribe to a false paradigm, no one is going to test your paradigm.
Vannevar Bush and FDR were wrong. The private sector can push forward the scientific frontier. Federal funding of R&D in America has flatlined for decades, while business investment keeps going up.
There's a direct correlation between the amount of money a company spends on pure science and its subsequent rate of profit. But there is no such correlation when the government is doing pure science in an ivory tower, because the companies don't know how to access that ivory tower pure science. They don't even know it exists half the time.
Abandoning NASA's Cold War space race monopoly, the government has outsourced rocket design to competing private companies. The world can barely keep pace with the breakthroughs announced by Silicon Valley's privately funded AI labs.
Science in America today is actually more private than it was in 1940. People just haven't seen it. No one wants to talk about it because there are no votes in privatizing science. But actually science and research has been increasingly privatized for the last 40 years. I would like to see that process continued.
Let's heed Eisenhower's warning.
Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite.
The question is not whether or not America should continue conducting scientific research. It's about who is in control.
It is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate these and other forces, new and old, within the principles of our democratic system, ever aiming toward the supreme goals of our free society.